Today, we are going to look at the most dumb ways Karens died. From coffee shop confrontations that ended in crushing tragedy to mobility scooter disasters at scenic overlooks, these incidents show how everyday entitlement can turn fatal in unexpected ways. It was December 23, 2017, and the holiday shopping frenzy filled the air at Pioneer Place Mall in Portland, Oregon. The Nordstrom department store buzzed with last-minute shoppers as nearly 200 customers navigated the crowded aisles, their voices creating a symphony of holiday stress and excitement. The scent of expensive perfume from the cosmetics counter mixed with the aroma of cinnamon from the nearby food court. Linda Blackwood wheeled her shopping cart toward the customer service counter with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. At 44, the mortgage broker had developed a pattern of fraudulent returns over the past several years, purchasing items, using them extensively, then returning them with fabricated complaints and demands for compensation. Linda had become a known problem customer at multiple retailers throughout the Pacific Northwest, with store employees learning to recognize her frequent attempts to return obviously used merchandise. She had been banned from several stores but continued her schemes by shopping at different locations and using various excuses for her returns. Her cart contained clearly used items, a designer handbag with visible wear marks, shoes that had obviously been worn outdoors, and clothing with deodorant stains and missing tags. Linda had prepared an elaborate story about receiving defective merchandise as gifts, complete with fake receipts and manufactured outrage. The customer service manager, Jennifer Walsh, recognized Linda immediately from previous encounters and reports from other stores. The store had been documenting her fraudulent activities for months, building a case with security footage and coordination with other retailers. Tonight would mark the end of Linda's return scam operation. When Jennifer politely refused the return of the clearly damaged designer handbag, Linda's carefully constructed facade crumbled instantly. Her face contorted with rage as she began shouting threats and accusations, her voice carrying across the entire store. Other customers backed away as Linda's tantrum escalated into violence. She shouted accusations across the store and threatened legal action against the company. In her fury, she began grabbing merchandise from nearby displays and hurling it at the customer service counter. Linda seized a heavy crystal vase from a holiday display, raising it above her head with both hands. Linda hurled the vase toward Jennifer's head, but the manager ducked behind the counter just in time. The heavy crystal struck the wall and shattered on impact. A large fragment deflected off the surface and hit Linda on the side of the neck, severing a major artery. She pressed her hand to the wound and collapsed among the merchandise as blood pooled across the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she was pronounced dead at the scene while shocked shoppers looked on. Security footage revealed the full extent of Linda's return fraud scheme, leading to a posthumous investigation that uncovered tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent returns. Multiple retailers provided evidence of her activities, and her family discovered significant credit card debt that highlighted the scope of her fraudulent operations. It was March 22, 2019 in Sedona, Arizona, a bright, windy afternoon that drew steady weekend crowds to the Red Rock lookouts along State Route 89A. The Vista Point near Cathedral Rock was busy that afternoon, with tourists taking photos and families walking up the gravel trail, leading to the elevated overlook. Among the visitors was 53-year-old Denise Harper, who had arrived with relatives in 2 cars after a long lunch downtown. Denise was a former receptionist who began using a small, 3-wheeled travel scooter after a knee injury she sustained during an argument at a shopping center several years earlier. According to family, she enjoyed visiting scenic areas and was confident operating the scooter on paved surfaces. That afternoon, she decided to follow her relatives partway up the viewing path, despite the posted sign restricting motorized vehicles beyond the parking lot. The trail itself was a narrow service road converted into a pedestrian path, climbing at a shallow angle before curving toward the overlook. Fine sandstone gravel lined the edges, and the drop-off on one side sloped several dozen feet down to a rocky basin. Visitors often paused midway to take pictures of the valley, leaning against the low wooden rail that served more as a marker than a barrier. Witnesses later told investigators that Denise appeared cheerful, but dismissive when others cautioned her about the trail's slope. A volunteer guide near the base reminded visitors that motorized scooters weren't recommended past the paved section. but Denise waved him off and continued upward. Family members said she insisted she knew what she was doing. The scooter's rear tires slipped occasionally on loose grit as she maneuvered around small rocks about halfway up. The incline steepened slightly. By 3:15 p.m., the family had reached a rest area just below the main overlook platform. Denise stopped a few yards behind them and took out her phone to take a panoramic photo. Witnesses nearby said she began adjusting her position to frame the background better, reversing slightly toward the open edge where the gravel thinned. Footage from another tourist's camera, later reviewed by investigators, showed the scooter's rear wheels spinning briefly before sliding over the worn edge of the trail. The combination of incline and loose rock caused the scooter to tilt backward. Denise instinctively leaned forward and turned the handlebars, but the shift in weight caused the left wheel to lift completely off the ground. Within seconds, the scooter tipped sideways and went over the slope. Several witnesses shouted as the chair rolled down the incline, striking rocks and brush before coming to rest roughly 20 feet below. Family members ran down the slope while others called 911. The fall had dislodged the scooter's seat and battery pack, both found a few feet away from where Denise lay motionless. Emergency crews from a local fire department arrived at 3:26 p.m. and used a rope line to access the area. Paramedics confirmed no signs of life at the scene. The county medical examiner later determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and upper torso, consistent with impact during a fall. Investigators from the sheriff's office documented tire marks leading from the main trail to the edge, confirming the scooter's loss of traction rather than intentional movement. The device's controls were found functioning normally, ruling out a mechanical malfunction. Authorities concluded that the fall was an accidental loss of control, compounded by unsuitable terrain. While the sign restricting motorized use was clearly visible at the trail entrance, no physical barrier prevented access. The overlook remained temporarily closed for safety assessment. Within a week, local officials installed reinforced fencing and additional signage warning visitors about unstable ground and prohibiting scooters, strollers, or wheeled equipment beyond the pavement. The family later told investigators they believed Denise had simply wanted a better view for her photo and underestimated how quickly the scooter could shift on loose rock. It was September 3, 2017, and the bustling atmosphere of a busy airport in Colorado created a symphony of rolling luggage, flight announcements, and thousands of travelers navigating the 1.5 million square foot facility. The Labor Day weekend had brought record crowds to the airport, with security lines stretching nearly 100 yards as TSA agents processed passengers through metal detectors and baggage scanners. Tammy Rodriguez clutched the nylon leash of her 15-pound peacock as she approached the security checkpoint, her fake service animal certification prominently displayed on a lanyard around her neck. At 39, the real estate agent had discovered that claiming her exotic pet was a medical necessity allowed her to bypass restrictions that applied to other travelers. She had purchased the fraudulent documentation online for $200, complete with official-looking seals and medical terminology that intimidated most business owners into compliance. Tammy's aggressive use of fake service animal laws had become her signature method for getting special treatment wherever she went. She had successfully bullied restaurants, hotels, and retail stores into accommodating her disruptive peacock by threatening discrimination lawsuits and making scenes that managers preferred to avoid. Her bird had already caused incidents by attacking other passengers on buses and defecating in shopping malls, but Tammy's legal threats had prevented any serious consequences. The peacock, named Napoleon, was completely untrained and had never received any legitimate service animal education. Tammy had chosen the exotic bird specifically because its unusual nature made people less likely to question her claims, and she enjoyed the attention and special treatment that came with having such an unusual companion. Her social media accounts were filled with photos of Napoleon in restaurants, airplanes, and other locations where pets were typically prohibited. Airport security had been warned about Tammy's previous attempts to bring Napoleon through checkpoints without proper documentation. She had been turned away twice in the past month, but each time she had returned with increasingly sophisticated fake paperwork and more aggressive demands for accommodation. As Tammy approached the TSA checkpoint, she immediately began filming with her phone while demanding that Napoleon be allowed through security without the standard documentation required for legitimate service animals. She shouted at the TSA agent about discrimination against her disability, though she had no qualifying medical condition that would require a service animal. The TSA supervisor explained the federal regulations governing service animals in airports, but Tammy's voice grew louder and more aggressive as she insisted that her fake certification was legally sufficient. Other passengers in line began backing away as her shouting escalated, and Napoleon became increasingly agitated by the commotion. Tammy screamed about violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, her face red with rage as she waved her fraudulent paperwork at the security officers. The peacock began spreading its tail feathers and making loud calls that echoed through the terminal, drawing stares from hundreds of nearby travelers. Napoleon's stress response to Tammy's shouting triggered the bird's natural defense mechanisms. The large peacock suddenly bolted away from the commotion, its powerful legs propelling it forward with surprising force. Tammy had clipped the nylon leash to her waist, and as Napoleon fled, the sudden jerk spun her around violently. The force on the leash pulled it upward over her shoulder and under her chin. The nylon line cinched tight against her throat like a garrote, tightening further each time the bird thrashed. Other passengers watched in horror as she clawed at the leash, her face turning blue as her airway was compressed. Security officers rushed to help within seconds, but they had no cutting tool readily available, and Napoleon continued thrashing, making it difficult to approach safely. By the time they managed to free the leash from around her neck, Tammy had lost consciousness. Despite immediate medical attention from airport paramedics, Tammy Rodriguez was pronounced dead at 2:34 p.m. from asphyxiation. The incident prompted calls for stricter verification of service animal documentation and clearer guidelines for handling disruptive animals in airports. Napoleon was euthanized, and investigations revealed that Tammy had no legitimate disability requiring a service animal. It was October 9th, 2016 in Manila, Philippines, on a warm, humid evening as hotel guests stepped onto their balconies to watch the sunset over the bay. The sky was clear, the water reflected orange light, and the upper floors were filled with people taking photos of the skyline. On the 27th floor was 29-year-old Lorna Del Monte, an office worker from Quezon City, on a weekend trip with two friends. Lorna was known among people who traveled with her for pushing limits during photos, climbing railings, leaning too far, and arguing with anyone who suggested she stop. She had already been pacing in and out of the balcony, complaining loudly that the railing was ruining her angles. The balcony had standard safety features: a waist-high railing, smooth floor tiles, and a lightweight patio chair. None of it was meant for climbing, but Lorna dragged the chair toward the edge anyway. Her friends told her several times to step down, but she brushed them off, telling them to quit exaggerating. Guests on the next balcony noticed her behavior. One woman leaned over and said in a calm voice that standing on the chair wasn't safe on a high floor. Lorna immediately snapped back, raising her voice so half the floor could hear. She insisted she had every right to take photos however she wanted, adding that she paid for this balcony and could use it any way she sees fit. The visitor tried again to warn her about the wobbling chair, but Lorna cut her off, telling her to mind her own business. Her friends tried to intervene, but Lorna waved them away, saying they were ruining her shot. She climbed onto the patio chair, holding her phone outward, repeating that people needed to stop policing everything. More guests stepped onto their balconies to capture the sunset. Several noticed Lorna shifting her stance on the chair, trying to tilt her phone farther out over the rail. A guest 2 floors above later reported seeing the chair legs slide slightly, each time she leaned forward. At 5:56 p.m., the light was at its brightest, a deep orange. Lorna leaned farther over the balcony, telling her friends she needed one more photo. Witnesses on the balcony said she pushed her whole upper body past the railing, while stretching her arm outward with her phone. As she shifted her weight, the back leg of the chair slid on the smooth tile. "Just an inch," her friend later said. but enough to throw off her footing. Since her upper body was already extended beyond the railing, that tiny slide pulled her center of gravity forward. The chair tipped, and her upper body went over with it. Guests on the 26th and 25th floors later reported hearing a sharp, heavy impact on the utility roof below. Several people on the pool deck looked up after hearing the same sound and notified hotel staff. From inside the room, one friend immediately called for help, while the other kept repeating that she had told Lorna to get off the chair. A guest in the neighboring room contacted emergency services after hearing the thud and seeing movement on the lower roof. Hotel security reached the utility roof within minutes and cleared the surrounding area. Lorna's friends were escorted indoors while responders conducted an on-scene assessment and secured the location for emergency crews. Investigators concluded that Lorna died from multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high-rise fall, noting the unstable chair, her position beyond the railing, and her refusal to step down as contributing factors. Staff later recovered her phone, which contained a partially framed bay photo taken seconds before the fall. Maintenance removed patio chairs from all upper-level balconies, and management added more prominent safety notices. It was March 7, 2013, and the austere chambers of a city hall in Texas, filled with the usual mix of concerned citizens and local activists, attending the monthly city council meeting. The 200-seat chamber echoed with conversations about municipal budgets and zoning issues, as residents waited their turn to address the council during the public comment period. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished wood surfaces while city officials reviewed their agenda items. Janet Morrison clutched her homemade protest signs as she waited for her turn to speak, her obsession with water fluoridation having consumed her life for the past 2 years. At 52, the dental hygienist had ironically become the city's most vocal anti-fluoride activist, despite her professional background in oral health. Her transformation had begun after reading conspiracy theories online that convinced her fluoride was a government mind control agent, rather than a public health measure. Janet's monthly appearances at city council meetings had become increasingly disruptive as she exceeded speaking time limits and interrupted other speakers with rambling speeches about fluoride dangers. Her former employer had terminated her after she began advising patients against using fluoridated toothpaste, leading to increased tooth decay in several children whose parents followed her advice. During the public comment period, Janet approached the podium with her large wooden signs and began her usual tirade about fluoride being used for population control. When the council president reminded her of the 3-minute speaking limit, Janet became agitated and started waving her protest signs while continuing to speak. Security officers approached to escort her from the podium, but Janet became violent and began swinging her heavy wooden signs at anyone who tried to remove her. In her frenzied movements, she stumbled backward while wildly swinging one of her large protest signs, losing her balance as she fought against the security officers trying to restrain her. Janet fell backward with tremendous force, striking her head against the marble steps leading up to the council chamber's raised platform. The impact caused severe head trauma, and she never regained consciousness despite immediate medical attention from paramedics who arrived within minutes. Janet Morrison was pronounced dead at 7:23 p.m. while still clutching pamphlets about fluoride dangers, her conspiracy theories claiming her life in the very chamber where she had spent years promoting them. The city council meeting was immediately adjourned, and ironically, Janet's death led to increased public support for water fluoridation, as residents rejected the extreme conspiracy theories that had consumed her final years. It was April 3, 2016, and the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of a grocery store in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as shoppers navigated the crowded aisles during the post-work rush. The 35,000-square-foot store buzzed with the familiar sounds of shopping carts, checkout scanners, and the occasional crying child as families stocked up for the week ahead. Margaret Thompson adjusted her collection of reusable shopping bags while surveying the produce section, with the critical eye of someone who had appointed herself the store's unofficial organic food inspector. At 52, The yoga instructor had transformed healthy eating into an obsession with food purity that consumed her every waking moment. Her apartment was filled with books about toxins, pesticides, and what she called the corporate poisoning of America's food supply. Margaret's reputation preceded her at every grocery store in the greater Baton Rouge area, where employees would brace themselves when they saw her approaching with her magnifying glass and pH testing strips she believed could reveal pesticide residue, though they were really designed for water testing. She had memorized the organic certification requirements of dozens of farms and would interrogate produce managers about the origins of every fruit and vegetable. What started as a commitment to healthy eating had evolved into an elaborate conspiracy theory involving conventional farmers, grocery chains, and government agencies that she believed were deliberately poisoning the population. She had already been banned from 2 stores for harassing customers about their food choices, yet she targeted different branches of smaller markets that lacked shared security systems, slipping in unnoticed despite prior bans. That afternoon, Margaret had arrived with her testing equipment to inspect the store's produce section, determined to expose what she called the contamination of organic foods with conventional products. She had brought her pH strips, magnifying glass, and a notebook to document violations of organic standards. Margaret began her inspection process by examining organic apples with her magnifying glass, looking for signs of pesticide residue or cross-contamination from conventional produce. When she discovered conventional and organic apples displayed in adjacent bins, she launched into a loud lecture about contamination and consumer fraud, demanding that the produce manager immediately separate all organic items. The store manager politely explained that the produce was properly labeled and met all regulatory requirements. Margaret's voice rose to a shout as she accused the staff of deliberately poisoning customers. She pulled out a small canister of spray she had bought from a fringe wellness website, an alcohol-based detox mist she believed could neutralize toxins on food. Margaret began spraying the conventional produce while screaming about pesticide poisoning, claiming she was decontaminating the food for other customers' safety. The spray contained a highly flammable alcohol-based solution that she believed would neutralize chemical residues. When a store employee tried to stop her, Margaret continued spraying while pulling out her phone to document what she called corporate resistance to food safety. Several shoppers later recalled smelling sharp chemical fumes moments before the flash. As Margaret filmed herself spraying the produce and lecturing about contamination, she accidentally triggered her lighter while trying to illuminate the organic certification labels for her video. The flame ignited the alcohol-based spray she had been using liberally throughout the produce section, creating a flash fire that engulfed her immediately. Margaret Thompson suffered fatal burns from the fire she had accidentally started with her own decontamination spray. She died before paramedics could arrive, her phone still recording as the flames consumed her organic food conspiracy theories along with her life. Investigators discovered her car contained thousands of pages of printed conspiracy theories about food contamination. Strangely, Margaret's purse contained a handwritten note that read, "Today, I expose the truth with no explanation," a detail that sparked endless speculation about whether she had planned something even more extreme than her usual confrontations. It was February 11th, 2018, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio. The sky was gray, the air cool, and residents were casually setting up tables for the community garage sale. Most people sorted boxes slowly, greeting neighbors and arranging items along their driveways without hurry. One of the participants was 46-year-old Carla Madsen, a part-time home organizer known for treating the annual sale like a competition. Her job involved critiquing how people arranged their spaces, and neighbors said she often carried that same attitude into community events. She had already told several people she intended to run the best table this year after feeling overlooked at the last sale. So when she stepped outside and decided her driveway looked too dim, her irritation started immediately. Carla flung open her garage and dragged out plastic bins filled with old decorations and household items. When one neighbor mentioned that the lighting wouldn't matter until buyers arrived later, Carla snapped back and accused them of undermining her setup. She shifted her bins around sharply, reorganizing and reorganizing her tables while muttering complaints each time something wasn't perfectly aligned. Still unhappy, she decided the driveway needed extra lighting. Instead of buying new equipment, she pulled out a plastic storage bin filled with extension cords she had collected over the years, some frayed, some taped, and one with a several-inch strip of exposed copper wire. When a nearby resident gently suggested that a few cords looked unsafe, Carla raised her voice, insisting everything worked fine last year and refusing the offer of a spare cord. She stretched the cords across her driveway toward the outdoor outlet, but instead of laying them flat, she dragged an old metal shelving rack closer to keep them out of the walkway. The bottom of the rack was damp from overnight moisture, and several witnesses said they saw her shoving it back and forth hard enough that it scraped loudly across the concrete. One neighbor later recalled hearing her muttering angrily as she tried to wedge the cords behind it. By 9:35 a.m., 2 cords were already plugged in. The light stayed off because the final connection had not been made yet. Carla crouched down with the damaged cord, the one with the exposed copper, and braced her other hand firmly on the damp metal rack as she reached toward the outlet. A man standing on his porch directly across the street reported seeing a quick blue flash under the rack, followed by a sharp popping snap. The exposed wiring had come into contact with the wet metal surface, energizing the entire frame. Because Carla was leaning on it for support, the current traveled through the rack and directly into her body. The same witness said he saw her body go rigid before she dropped face first onto the concrete. Several residents on the block later reported a brief flicker of lights inside their homes at the same moment. People approached her driveway but stopped short, unsure if the rack or outlet was still live. Someone yelled to cut the breaker, and a neighbor ran into the garage to shut it off, sending the lights dark at once. Emergency responders arrived minutes later, and neighbors watched from the sidewalk as paramedics assessed her, though no one close by could hear the details. Inspectors later reviewed the cords, outlet, and shelving rack. They concluded that the exposed copper, the damp metal surface, and Carla's direct hand contact created a complete electrical path the moment she tried to connect the final cord. Officials confirmed that she died at the scene from cardiac arrest, caused by fatal electrocution consistent with household current under wet contact conditions. The next day, her family removed all the old electrical supplies from the garage and hired a professional to update the wiring and replace the outdoor outlet. It was July 22, 2017, and the scorching afternoon heat of Fresno, California, created shimmering waves above the vast asphalt parking lot of the Walmart Supercenter as hundreds of shoppers navigated the maze of cars searching for available spaces. The temperature had reached 104 degrees, making tempers run even hotter than usual. Linda Martinez sat in her air-conditioned Honda Civic, surveying the parking lot through binoculars while making detailed notes in a spiral notebook dedicated to documenting what she perceived as shopping cart violations. At 45, the bank teller had transformed shopping cart enforcement into her personal crusade, spending her weekends patrolling shopping centers and confronting customers who failed to return their carts to designated areas. Her car's console contained homemade violation notices, a digital camera, and a measuring tape for documenting cart abandonment. Linda's obsession with shopping cart justice had begun 2 years earlier when she witnessed a runaway cart scratch her car in a parking lot, leading her to study store policies and develop an encyclopedic knowledge of shopping cart etiquette. She had appointed herself a vigilante enforcer, photographing abandoned carts and lecturing shoppers about their civic responsibilities. The escalation from documenting violations to actively confronting other shoppers had been gradual, starting with polite reminders about cart return policies and evolving into aggressive confrontations. Linda carried business cards identifying herself as a shopping cart compliance volunteer and would lecture customers about the social contract of shared retail spaces. That afternoon, Linda spotted a family loading groceries into their minivan while their empty shopping cart sat unattended nearby, slowly rolling toward other parked cars in the 104-degree heat. Determined to ensure they learned proper cart etiquette, Linda marched over to confront them about their negligent behavior. When the family finished loading their groceries and prepared to leave, Linda positioned herself directly behind their cart and launched into her prepared speech about shopping cart responsibility. The frustrated parents, dealing with tired children and melting frozen foods in the extreme heat, tried to retrieve their cart to return it properly. Instead of allowing them to take the cart, Linda grabbed it and began pushing it back toward their vehicle while shouting about civic duty and retail courtesy. She was determined to complete her lecture about proper shopping cart etiquette, even as she backed the heavy metal cart toward the family's minivan at approximately 2 miles per hour. Linda, focused on her lecture and not watching where she was going, backed directly into the path of another shopper's SUV that was slowly reversing out of a parking space. The late afternoon glare off parked car windshields and Linda's crouched position behind the cart made her nearly invisible in the SUV's rearview mirror. The driver, checking their mirrors for pedestrians, didn't see her until it was too late. Linda was struck by the reversing vehicle and knocked to the ground, suffering massive head trauma that killed her within minutes. The driver was initially questioned, but security footage clearly showed Linda's erratic behavior and her failure to watch for traffic while pursuing her cart crusade. Her car contained over 3,000 photographs of abandoned shopping carts, evidence of an obsession that had consumed her life and ultimately caused her death. It was July 18, 2015, at a county fairgrounds in central Iowa. The afternoon was warm and sticky, food stands were crowded, and people moved between games, booths, and small attractions. Near the center of the fair, volunteers set up a simple stage for a corn dog eating contest sponsored by a local diner. It was meant to be slow, friendly, and easy. One of the participants was 45-year-old Karen Halford, a part-time receptionist known in her neighborhood for arguing with staff at nearly every community event. Volunteers recognized her immediately. She had caused problems at raffles, parking areas, and even kids' craft tables. Karen often treated rules as optional and insisted she deserved exceptions whenever she showed up. At registration, the organizer, Tom, explained the simple rules. Small bites, normal pace, water as needed. It wasn't timed. It wasn't a race. Witnesses said Karen cut him off almost immediately, talking over him and saying she didn't need instructions. Several people in line stepped aside as she kept arguing, insisting she would do it her own way. When Tom handed her the waiver, Karen objected again. A volunteer later said she argued for a couple of minutes, calling the form pointless, before finally signing with quick, forceful strokes. At the table, a front-row spectator saw her drag her tray closer, despite instructions to keep everything aligned for the cable recording. When Tom reminded her, she snapped that he was targeting her and refused to move it back. At 2:03 p.m., the contest began. Most people took small bites, laughed, and talked casually. Karen did the opposite. She grabbed each corn dog near the base and took large, fast bites, barely chewing. Several spectators later said it looked like she was trying to beat everyone, even though no one else was treating it like a competition. About 2 minutes in, she reached for her third corn dog. She bit off a large piece and tilted her head back to swallow it quickly. A nearby volunteer started to remind her to slow down, but Karen waved him off without breaking rhythm. Seconds later, she began coughing. Witnesses described it as short, sharp coughs at first, more like she was trying to push the food down. Then, according to security footage reviewed later, her upper body went rigid, and her arms pulled in close to her chest. The coughing stopped altogether. She reached for her water cup but dropped it before she could drink. Spectators saw Karen stagger sideways, knocking over her tray and spilling water across the platform. 2 people with basic first aid training stepped forward. One attempted abdominal thrusts while the other tried to check if anything was visible in her mouth, but nothing changed. The obstruction did not move. EMTs arrived within minutes. Ushers moved benches to clear a path as responders came through. From the edge of the crowd, people could see EMTs continuing airway checks and performing additional thrusts, but no visible response followed. The stage was closed off, and fair staff blocked the area with temporary fencing. Food-related events were canceled for the rest of the day. Later that evening, officials confirmed that Karen Halford died from a complete airway blockage caused by a large, unchewed piece of food. Security footage showed her ignoring the safety instructions, rushing through the contest, and refusing reminders to slow down. Fair organizers removed all eating competitions from future schedules and added updated guidelines stressing slow, careful consumption at public food activities. It was June 3, 2016, when 51-year-old Faith Morgan arrived at the Henderson family's house in Sunset Hills subdivision, Charlotte, North Carolina, at 7 in the morning, armed with her measuring tape and an obsessive need to control every aspect of her neighborhood. After retiring from a government clerical position 6 months earlier, Faith had transformed her newfound free time into a reign of terror over her fellow residents. Faith's retirement had unleashed something dark within her personality. Without the structure of her mundane filing job, she had appointed herself as the neighborhood's unofficial standards coordinator, patrolling the streets daily with military-like dedication. Her garage was filled with meticulously organized files containing photographs, measurements, and violation reports on nearly every house in the subdivision. Over 2 years, Faith had filed over 200 complaints with the Homeowners Association, targeting families with children, elderly residents struggling with maintenance, and anyone she deemed undesirable. Her victims included a widow whose grass grew over regulation height and an elderly veteran whose mailbox had faded paint. The Hendersons had become Faith's primary target after their teenage son installed a basketball hoop that extended 6 inches over their property line. Despite the family's attempts to reason with her, Faith had escalated the situation through multiple HOA complaints, threatening legal action, and demanding immediate removal of the recreational equipment. On this particular morning, Faith had arrived to document what she called flagrant violations of neighborhood covenants. She carried her digital camera, measuring tape, and a notebook filled with property regulations she had memorized word for word. When no one answered her aggressive knocking at the front door, Faith decided to conduct her own property inspection. She walked around to the backyard, where an electrical contractor was working on the Hendersons' outdoor lighting system. The licensed electrician, Mike Rodriguez, was installing new fixtures and had cordoned off his work area with caution tape. Faith immediately confronted Mike about permits and code violations, demanding to see his documentation while threatening to report him for illegal work. Mike tried explaining he was properly licensed and the work was permitted, but Faith was beyond reason, her obsession with control overriding basic safety concerns. Ignoring Mike's warnings about staying away from his equipment, Faith ducked under the caution tape to photograph what she claimed was illegal installation work. She was determined to document every angle of the supposed violation, convinced she had discovered a major infraction. In her zealous pursuit of evidence, Faith stepped too close to Mike's work area while taking photos. She brushed against an exposed live wire on one of the fixtures, sending a powerful electrical shock through her body. Faith immediately collapsed, her muscles convulsing violently as she lost consciousness. Mike quickly shut off the power and called 911, while a neighbor who heard the commotion came to help. Faith was unconscious and showing agonal breathing when paramedics arrived. They worked on her extensively before transporting her to the hospital, but she never regained consciousness and died later that day from complications of electrocution. The investigation confirmed that Mike's work was properly permitted, and the equipment fault was unforeseeable. The Hendersons were devastated despite years of harassment from Faith. The neighborhood gradually became more peaceful after her death. It was September 9, 2013, and the dinner rush at a fast food restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, created a chaotic symphony of sizzling fryers, beeping timers, and shouted orders as teenage employees struggled to keep up with the demands of hungry customers. The temperature outside had reached 108 degrees, driving people indoors and creating longer than usual lines. Deborah Walsh adjusted her phone's camera settings as she prepared to document what she planned would be another successful confrontation with minimum wage workers. At 38, The dental receptionist had transformed complaining into an art form, visiting the same fast food location daily to find fault with everything from food temperature to service speed. Her phone's photo gallery contained hundreds of images of allegedly substandard meals, which she used as evidence in her frequent demands for free food. Deborah's daily routine involved strategic visits to fast food restaurants during peak hours, when stressed employees were most likely to make mistakes she could exploit. She had memorized corporate complaint procedures for dozens of chains and could recite specific policy numbers during her confrontations with teenage workers. The transformation from occasional complainer to professional food scammer had begun when Deborah discovered that aggressive behavior and threats of social media exposure could result in free meals and gift cards. She had developed increasingly elaborate schemes for manufacturing complaints, including bringing her own cold food to claim temperature violations. That evening, Deborah had arrived during the 6 p.m. dinner rush with her phone fully charged and her complaint strategy prepared. She ordered her standard meal and immediately began her inspection process, photographing the burger from multiple angles, while loudly commenting about its allegedly improper assembly. When the teenage cashier offered to remake the burger, Deborah rejected the solution and demanded to speak with the manager immediately. She began filming the interaction while explaining to other customers that she was documenting discrimination and poor service for social media exposure. The manager, a 19-year-old college student, politely addressed Deborah's complaints and offered multiple solutions, including a refund, replacement meal, or store credit. None of these options satisfied Deborah, who had come specifically to create a confrontation. Determined to get the perfect camera angle for her complaint video, Deborah climbed onto the service counter while continuing to film and lecture the employees. She wanted to capture what she claimed were health code violations in the kitchen area, despite having no knowledge of actual food safety regulations. While gesturing dramatically for her video and berating the teenage workers, Deborah stepped backward on the narrow counter to get a wider shot. She lost her footing and fell backward off the counter, striking her head on the hard tile floor with tremendous force. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fractured skull. Deborah Walsh died from massive brain injury within minutes of her fall, her phone still recording as she lay motionless on the restaurant floor. The footage from her phone showed that she had been planning to post the confrontation on social media with the caption "Exposing the fast food corruption," a post that was never published, leaving her followers to wonder what had happened to their daily dose of complaint content. It was July 15, 2016, when 34-year-old Haley Grant arrived at Maplewood Community Pool in suburban Ohio, armed with her usual arsenal of complaints and barely contained rage. As a middle manager at a local insurance company, Haley had perfected the art of making everyone around her miserable, treating colleagues like incompetent children and neighbors like personal enemies. Her recent divorce had only amplified her bitter personality. Rather than examining her own role in the marriage's failure, Haley blamed everyone else for her mounting legal fees and custody battles. She had become the neighborhood's most feared resident, filing noise complaints over children playing and threatening lawsuits against the Homeowners Association over trivial infractions like mailbox heights and grass length. The sweltering Saturday afternoon found the community pool packed with families seeking relief from the 90-degree heat. Haley immediately zeroed in on her target, a Hispanic family enjoying the water with their children. Her insurance background had taught her to scrutinize every detail, and she applied this skill to policing who belonged in her community. Marching toward the teenage lifeguard, Haley launched into her familiar routine of demands and threats. She insisted the family be removed, claiming they probably weren't even residents, and threatening to call immigration services. The young lifeguard, barely 18 and earning minimum wage for summer work, tried explaining that all pool users had shown proper identification and paid their fees. But Haley's rage was building to a dangerous crescendo. Her face flushed red as she stormed toward the pool deck, hurling racial slurs at the family while other swimmers watched in horror. Several parents began gathering their children, recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation. The pool's peaceful atmosphere transformed into tense silence as her voice echoed across the water. In her fury, Haley gestured wildly while backing toward the diving area, completely unaware of her surroundings. The wet concrete around pools becomes treacherous when combined with aggressive movement and poor judgment. Her foot slipped on the slick surface, sending her tumbling backward toward the deep end. Witnesses heard a loud crack as Haley's head struck the diving board's metal structure. She hit the water hard and didn't surface. Blood began spreading through the water around her floating body. The teenage lifeguard immediately dove in and pulled her to the pool's edge with help from other swimmers. Haley was unconscious, bleeding from her head, and not breathing. Someone called 911 while others attempted CPR. Paramedics arrived within minutes and worked on her briefly before rushing her to the hospital. She never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead later that evening. The Hispanic family she had targeted stayed to provide statements to police, expressing genuine sadness despite her treatment of them. Security footage confirmed the incident was accidental, though witnesses noted her aggressive behavior had preceded the fall. Her ex-husband declined to speak with reporters about the incident. The community pool installed additional safety features and anti-slip surfaces following the tragedy, but neighbors quietly acknowledged the ironic circumstances. Local news coverage focused primarily on pool safety measures, rather than the confrontation that led to the accident. The woman who spent years trying to exclude others from her community had ultimately excluded herself from life itself through her own reckless hatred and misplaced anger. Her two children, who had witnessed their mother's toxic behavior for years, were left to process not only her sudden death, but the shameful circumstances surrounding it. It was September 12, 2015, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Sunset Ridge, an exclusive gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona. The 4,200-square-foot clubhouse buzzed with tension as nearly 80 residents filed into the main conference room, their voices creating an anxious murmur that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The smell of fresh coffee from the hospitality station mixed with the faint scent of desert sage that drifted through the open windows. Patricia Whitfield adjusted her reading glasses one final time as she surveyed the crowd from behind the mahogany podium, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving despite the gentle breeze from the air conditioning. At 52, the tyrannical HOA president had spent 6 years transforming the once peaceful community into her personal kingdom of rules and regulations. Her day job as a high-end real estate agent provided the income to support her obsessive lifestyle, but controlling her neighbors had become her true calling. Patricia carried a measuring tape and digital camera everywhere, documenting violations with the precision of a crime scene investigator. Her daily patrol routes covered every inch of the community's 240 acres, and she maintained detailed files on each of the 156 households. Residents had learned to peek through their curtains before stepping outside, knowing that Patricia might be lurking nearby with her citation book. Her aggressive enforcement had pushed several families into costly disputes over fines and legal fees. The Hendersons eventually sold their home after repeated citations over minor property issues escalated into thousands of dollars in penalties. Another family left after a prolonged conflict over landscaping rules, leaving neighbors wary of Patricia's zero-tolerance approach. Patricia took immense pride in her zero-tolerance policy and frequently boasted to other HOA presidents about maintaining the highest property values in Maricopa County. She had called tonight's special meeting to discuss her latest crusade: new restrictions that would ban all outdoor holiday decorations and limit pet ownership to one small dog per household. The meeting began with Patricia's characteristic intensity as she clicked through her PowerPoint presentation, each slide detailing new violations she had discovered and the corresponding fines she planned to implement. Her voice grew more shrill as residents began questioning her authority, their frustration evident after years of living under her oppressive rule. Patricia raised her voice as she pointed to photos of Halloween displays, insisting they lowered property values. She then turned to pet owners, blaming large dogs for the constant noise. To drive her point home, she stepped onto a chair at the front of the room. The frame shifted unsteadily beneath her weight as she continued addressing the crowd. Without warning, one of the chair's legs gave way. Patricia fell backward, her head striking the stone fireplace hearth with a sharp crack that silenced the room. The impact fractured her neck instantly, and she collapsed to the floor without movement. Blood began pooling around Patricia's head as shocked residents fumbled for their phones to call 911. She lay motionless, still clutching her violation citation book, her final words having been threats about implementing $100 daily fines for Christmas decorations. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but Patricia Whitfield was pronounced dead at the scene. The HOA dissolved within 6 months, as residents voted overwhelmingly to eliminate the oppressive rules Patricia had implemented. Property values actually increased once the community became known for its welcoming atmosphere rather than strict regulations. The clubhouse fireplace was removed and replaced with a memorial garden promoting community harmony, though few mourned Patricia's passing. It was November 15, 2016, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves across the parking lot of Maple Grove Elementary School in Minnesota. The school auditorium buzzed with tension as nearly 150 parents, teachers, and board members filled the folding chairs, their voices creating an anxious murmur that echoed off the 20-foot ceiling. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the institutional beige walls decorated with student artwork. Susan Hutchinson adjusted her stack of printed research articles as she prepared for what she considered her most important presentation yet. At 49, the pharmaceutical sales representative had become a familiar presence at every school board meeting over the past 3 years. Known for her persistence and increasingly forceful positions, she often cited medical terminology and research articles to support her arguments. Her background in pharmaceutical sales lent her authority when she spoke, though her interpretations of the studies she referenced were often incomplete. Over time, her advocacy campaigns led to several staff departures and curriculum changes, prompting concern among teachers and administrators. What began as parent involvement gradually grew into a cycle of conflict that left the school community divided. Her latest crusade involved demanding the complete removal of all technology from classrooms, claiming that Wi-Fi signals caused irreversible brain damage in developing children. She had spent weeks preparing tonight's presentation, complete with cherry-picked studies and inflammatory rhetoric designed to terrify other parents into supporting her cause. Susan's own children had become increasingly isolated as other families avoided association with her extremist views. Teachers walked on eggshells around her kids, afraid that any perceived slight would trigger another of Susan's explosive confrontations with the administration. As Susan began her impassioned speech about the dangers of wireless technology, her voice grew increasingly shrill and her gestures more erratic. She had been experiencing severe chest pains and shortness of breath for weeks, but attributed her symptoms to the school's wireless network, rather than the chronic stress of her constant outrage. She raised her voice, waving papers frantically, and insisting Wi-Fi signals were harming children. Her face had turned bright red, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool evening temperature, as she continued her presentation about the alleged dangers of wireless technology. Suddenly, Susan clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes widening in terror as crushing pain radiated down her left arm. She stumbled backward from the podium, her breathing turned shallow. Between strained gasps, she repeated that the Wi-Fi was making her sick before collapsing onto the auditorium floor as board members and parents rushed to help. She suffered a massive heart attack linked to chronic hypertension and stress. Despite the quick response of paramedics, Susan Hutchinson was pronounced dead at Maple Grove Hospital at 9:23 p.m., her final words being demands that the Wi-Fi was killing her. The autopsy revealed severe coronary artery disease exacerbated by chronic stress and hypertension. Her group faded, and the board emphasized respectful debate at future meetings. The school board also established a mental health awareness program for parents struggling with education-related anxiety. It was April 15, 2014, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Children's Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, as dozens of protesters gathered with their handmade signs and megaphones. The 200-bed medical facility had become ground zero for a growing anti-vaccine movement, with demonstrators blocking sidewalks and harassing families seeking medical care for their children. The smell of hot asphalt mixed with exhaust fumes from idling cars as parents tried to navigate around the increasingly aggressive crowd. Cheryl Brennan adjusted her vaccines kill sign as she surveyed her followers from her position near the emergency entrance. At 43, The administrative assistant had transformed from a quiet office worker into the self-proclaimed leader of Arizona's most vocal anti-vaccine group, after spending countless hours reading conspiracy theories on obscure websites. Her conversion had begun 2 years earlier, when her youngest daughter developed a fever after routine immunizations, an event that Cheryl became convinced was evidence of a massive medical conspiracy. Cheryl's weekly protests had grown from a handful of concerned parents to nearly 50 dedicated followers who hung on her every word about the dangers of childhood vaccines. She had convinced dozens of families to avoid immunizing their children, leading to 3 separate measles outbreaks in local schools that had forced temporary closures. Her own 3 children had been expelled from their elementary school after she refused to provide required immunization records, forcing her to homeschool them using curriculum that reinforced her anti-medical beliefs. The hospital's security team had grown accustomed to Cheryl's increasingly aggressive tactics, which included following doctors to their cars and shouting at nurses through the facility's windows. She carried a bullhorn everywhere and had memorized dozens of debunked studies that she would cite during her confrontations with medical professionals. Her husband had left her 6 months earlier, taking their children and citing her dangerous obsession as grounds for divorce. That morning's protest had attracted local news coverage after Cheryl announced plans to physically block the hospital's emergency entrance during peak hours. She had spent the previous evening preparing inflammatory speeches and coordinating with her followers through encrypted messaging apps that she believed protected them from government surveillance. As the morning progressed, Cheryl positioned herself directly in front of the emergency bay doors, her followers forming a human chain that prevented ambulances from accessing the facility. When a paramedic unit arrived with a 7-year-old boy experiencing a severe asthma attack, Cheryl refused to move despite desperate pleas from the medical crew. Witnesses later said Cheryl shouted through her bullhorn, accusing the hospital of harming children as she blocked the ambulance's path. The child's mother could be seen pleading from inside the vehicle, but Cheryl refused to move, convinced she was protecting the boy rather than preventing treatment. In her frenzy to stop the ambulance, several of Cheryl's supporters helped lift her onto the hood of the vehicle as cameras rolled. She climbed toward the roof, gripping the metal light bar while shouting through her bullhorn. The surface was slick with early morning dew and vibration from the idling engine, and her sneakers slipped against the smooth fiberglass. As she tried to steady herself, she lost her footing and fell backward, striking the back of her head on the pavement near the curb. Witnesses saw her briefly twitch before going still. Paramedics immediately began resuscitation efforts and rushed her inside the hospital she had been blocking, but she was pronounced dead within minutes from severe traumatic brain injury. Cheryl Brennan's death stunned the crowd gathered outside. Within days, attendance at the protests dwindled, and several of her followers publicly distanced themselves from the movement she had led. The boy with asthma was successfully treated and made a full recovery. It was July 19, 2018, in Tampa, Florida. A humid afternoon with heat shimmering off the pavement of a strip mall parking lot. The lunchtime rush was steady at a small cafe known for its drive-through coffee line that often wrapped around the building. Most customers waited patiently in the slow crawl of cars, but one driver stood out that day. 44-year-old Darlene Cooper, a part-time insurance clerk who came by a few times a week. Co-workers later said Darlene had a habit of recording minor confrontations on her phone, whether it was with store clerks, delivery drivers, or neighbors. That afternoon, she ordered a large hot coffee and a muffin from the cafe. When the drink was handed to her through the window, she lifted the cup, looked at the lid, and complained that it wasn't filled all the way. The worker apologized and offered to make a new one, but Darlene began raising her voice, drawing attention from other cars in line. Witnesses in nearby cars said she began shouting that she was being cheated out of her money. The cashier tried again to hand her a new cup, but Darlene tossed the one she'd been given through the open window. The coffee splashed across the counter and hit a young worker's arm. Security footage later showed staff stepping back in shock as Darlene drove forward a few feet, threw her SUV into park, and got out. She walked quickly toward the window, still holding her phone up in front of her. The video later recovered from that phone showed her yelling about poor service, demanding the worker's name, and pacing near the concrete post that marked the edge of the drive-through lane. The manager inside told her to leave, or he would call the police. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back toward her vehicle, muttering that she had evidence. Customers in line behind her recalled that she was still recording while pulling open the driver door. The air outside was thick, over 90 degrees, and the sound of idling engines mixed with her shouting. She set her phone on the dashboard mount, half inside the car, half standing outside. The door was still wide open. According to investigators who later reviewed the footage, what happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Darlene swung her leg inside, trying to slam the door shut with her left hand while keeping her phone balanced on the dashboard mount. The engine was still running, and as she moved to sit back down, her foot pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The SUV jerked forward with a short screech of tires. The open door hit the concrete post beside her parking space. The metal folded backward, trapping her between the door's inner edge and the car frame. The force crushed her upper chest against the steering column. The phone recording captured a burst of noise, then went still. A man 2 cars behind witnessed the entire impact. He said he first thought the vehicle had simply stalled, but when he saw Darlene's body pinned in the doorway, he jumped out of his car and ran toward her. The engine was still revving in gear, wheels spinning against the curb. He tried pulling the handle, but the twisted door was jammed against the post. Another driver shouted for someone to turn off the ignition. A woman reached through the passenger side to switch it off, but by then there was no movement from Darlene. The cafe staff locked the drive-through window and called emergency services, while the line of cars backed away to give space. Responders later said that the position of the SUV and the bent metal frame made extraction difficult. It took several minutes to pry the door loose enough to reach her paramedics, later noted severe chest trauma, consistent with high compression from the door hinge. Investigators pieced together the timeline mostly from her own phone. The video began with her ordering coffee and continued all the way through her shouting at staff, walking back to the SUV, and getting in. The final image froze on the steering wheel a split second before the sound of impact. Authorities classified the death as accidental, caused by blunt force injuries to the chest. They noted there was no evidence of mechanical failure, only driver error combined with distraction. Witnesses confirmed that the outburst over the half-filled cup lasted nearly 3 minutes before the fatal moment. By evening, the cafe reopened the lane. The bent post stayed for days while the video remained unreleased, though investigators confirmed it captured the full argument. The case was ruled an accidental death, a fatal mistake that turned an ordinary argument over coffee into a tragedy. It was March 8, 2014, and the mild evening air carried the sounds of clinking glasses and animated conversation through the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina. Giuseppe's Italian restaurant hummed with activity as nearly 60 diners enjoyed their meals in the elegantly appointed dining room, the soft lighting from crystal chandeliers creating an intimate atmosphere. The aroma of garlic and fresh basil filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of aged wine from the restaurant's extensive collection. Brenda Pemberton adjusted her designer reading glasses as she surveyed the menu with the calculating gaze of someone preparing for battle. At 47, the insurance claims adjuster had built a notorious reputation throughout Charleston's restaurant scene as a serial complainer who turned every dining experience into an opportunity for confrontation and compensation. Her pattern of exaggerated grievances and threats of lawsuits had made her a dreaded customer at establishments across the Southeast. Restaurant managers throughout Charleston knew Brenda by name and would often comp her meals preemptively to avoid the lengthy confrontations that could last for hours and disrupt their other customers. Her insurance background had taught her exactly which complaints would generate the fastest results and how to phrase her grievances to suggest potential liability issues that restaurant owners feared most. Brenda had developed a systematic approach to her restaurant complaints, always arriving with a mental list of potential issues she could exploit. She understood how to escalate minor service problems into major incidents that would result in free meals, cash settlements, or both. Local restaurant staff had learned to recognize her tactics but many establishments still found it easier to appease her than to deal with the scenes she would create. Tonight's target was Giuseppe's, an upscale establishment she had been planning to visit for months. She arrived with her usual arsenal of potential complaints, having researched the restaurant's online reviews to identify service issues that other customers had mentioned. Her goal was ambitious: a full refund plus additional compensation for what she would claim was unacceptable treatment. Brenda began her usual routine immediately, loudly criticizing the bread temperature and demanding to speak with the manager before her appetizer arrived. When manager Tony Ricci politely offered to replace her meal, Brenda escalated the situation by throwing her wine glass against the wall, the crystal shattering as it struck the exposed brick. She stood on her chair to address the entire dining room, shouting accusations about the restaurant's service and demanding satisfaction for her treatment. In her dramatic performance, she gestured wildly with her arms while berating the staff and threatening legal action against the establishment. During her theatrical display, Brenda knocked over a large decorative wine barrel that had been positioned near her table as part of the restaurant's rustic Italian theme. The empty oak barrel, used purely for decoration but improperly secured to its base, tipped forward from her movement and rolled toward the wall. The barrel struck Brenda's torso and pinned her against the brick surface. The impact fractured several ribs and compressed her chest cavity, preventing her from breathing properly. Witnesses said she gasped once before collapsing to the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she was unresponsive and later pronounced dead at the scene. Emergency medical personnel arrived quickly, but were unable to revive her. The restaurant faced a wrongful death lawsuit from Brenda's family, though security footage clearly documented her aggressive behavior leading up to the accident. Other local establishments came forward with evidence of her pattern of fraudulent complaints, creating a complex legal situation. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but Giuseppe's installed safety barriers around all decorative items and implemented staff training for handling difficult customers. Brenda's death became a cautionary tale in Charleston's restaurant community about the dangers of escalating customer service disputes. It was November 8th, 2020, and the fluorescent lights of a grocery store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, hummed overhead as Tuesday morning shoppers navigated the aisles with their carts and shopping lists. The 45,000-square-foot store had implemented new health protocols during flu season, requiring masks and providing hand sanitizer stations throughout the facility. Signs posted at every entrance reminded customers of the temporary safety measures designed to protect the community's health. Diane Fletcher sat in her car in the parking lot, applying lipstick and checking her phone one final time before entering the store without the required face covering. At 48, the insurance agent had made defying public health guidelines her personal crusade, viewing every safety measure as government overreach that threatened her constitutional freedoms. Her social media accounts were filled with videos of her confronting store employees and deliberately violating health protocols while filming herself for her 3,000 followers. Diane's aggressive behavior had escalated over the past 6 months, resulting in bans from 4 different grocery stores and 2 pharmacies throughout Tulsa. She had organized freedom rallies in public spaces where participants would intentionally violate health measures, often targeting businesses that enforced safety guidelines. Her insurance clients had begun dropping her after videos of her confrontational behavior went viral. But Diane viewed their rejection as proof that she was fighting the right battle. Her morning routine now included planning which businesses to target for her daily protests, often choosing locations where she knew her disruptive behavior would attract the most attention. Diane carried a small camera everywhere, hoping to capture footage of what she called tyrannical enforcement of health measures that she could use to build her online following. The store manager had been warned about Diane's previous visits and had instructed employees to call security immediately if she appeared. Her reputation for aggressive confrontations and deliberate attempts to expose other customers to illness had made her a significant liability for any business she entered. Diane burst through the automatic doors with characteristic defiance, immediately approaching the customer service desk, where the manager stood reviewing the morning's sales reports. She announced loudly that she was there to shop without wearing what she called a communist face diaper, pulling out her phone to begin recording the interaction. When the manager politely asked her to leave, Diane began her usual routine of coughing deliberately on nearby customers while filming their reactions. She moved through the produce section, touching fruits and vegetables while coughing on them, her behavior becoming increasingly erratic as other shoppers backed away in disgust and fear. Security guards approached cautiously, having been trained to de-escalate situations involving disruptive customers. But Diane's behavior escalated rapidly as she began throwing canned goods at employees, screaming about her constitutional rights while continuing to film herself. Her face was flushed with rage as she grabbed items from shelves and hurled them at anyone who tried to approach her. In her fury, Diane knocked over a large end-cap display of glass pasta sauce jars, sending dozens of containers crashing to the floor. As she stepped backward to avoid the falling merchandise, a large jar struck her upper thigh and shattered. A sharp glass shard drove upward into the inner portion of her upper thigh, severing her femoral artery. Blood began spurting from the wound with each heartbeat as Diane collapsed among the broken glass and scattered canned goods. Her phone continued recording on the floor beside her, while employees rushed to apply pressure to the wound. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Diane Fletcher was pronounced dead shortly afterward from massive blood loss caused by a femoral artery injury. In the aftermath, the store received several complaints from customers who said they had been deliberately coughed on during the incident, and security footage of her final confrontation spread rapidly online. It was May 3, 2017, in Mesa, Arizona, on a warm, clear afternoon. The grocery store's parking lot was busy, with carts moving between rows and cars shifting slowly through the front drive. Sun glare bounced off windshields, making it harder for drivers to see pedestrians stepping into the lane. One of the shoppers leaving the store was 42-year-old Dana Mullis, a medical billing clerk known in her neighborhood for arguing over small issues and demanding managers for minor problems. And that afternoon was no different. Witnesses said that inside the store she had already caused a scene over expired coupons, insisting the cashier honor them anyway, and asking for the manager twice. Several shoppers saw her leave the checkout line visibly frustrated. Dana walked toward her sedan parked in one of the closest spaces. At the same time, a compact car pulled into the stall beside hers, stopping slightly over the painted line. According to people loading groceries nearby, Dana noticed instantly and launched into complaints, waving her arms at the driver and demanding they fix how they parked. Those who witnessed it said she spoke loudly enough that several rows of shoppers turned to follow the scene. As the exchange continued, Dana stepped backward while still facing the compact car. Witnesses later said she made small, abrupt backward steps. More yelling, another step, more pointing, without looking behind her. The store's security camera showed that she moved into the drive lane at an angle, still engaged in the midst of the argument. At the same time, a pickup truck was turning through the lane toward the store exit at roughly 8 to 10 miles per hour. The driver later explained that a large SUV parked near the corner blocked his view of anyone walking out between the cars. As he turned, the truck's front fender cleared the blind spot just as Dana backed into the lane. Footage showed the driver hit the brakes immediately, but the distance was too short. The truck made contact with Dana at low speed. Witnesses estimated it looked similar to a parking lot bump, but because she was already leaning backward and unprepared, the impact spun her off balance. A shopper pushing a cart said she fell straight back, striking the back of her head on the rounded edge of the concrete curb. The sound made several people stop in place. The truck stopped immediately, and Dana remained unresponsive. A trained bystander checked her airway, while another called for help. Store staff brought a first aid kit and cleared the area. Fire department medics arrived within minutes, assessed her severe head injury, and prepared her for transport. Later that evening, authorities confirmed that Dana died from severe blunt head trauma caused by the backward fall. The medical report noted that the low-speed impact alone was not fatal, but the unbraced fall onto the curb created enough force to cause a catastrophic injury. In the weeks that followed, the store repainted crosswalk lines, added a pedestrian-only walkway in front of the main row, and posted signs reminding customers to watch for moving cars before stepping backward into the lane. It was August 12, 2015, when 29-year-old Olivia Carter walked into Bella Vista Italian restaurant in Miami, Florida, armed with her smartphone and a carefully crafted plan to scam another free meal. As a part-time call center worker who spent most of her energy writing fake negative reviews, Olivia had turned restaurant fraud into her primary source of income. With barely 800 Instagram followers, Olivia claimed to be a food influencer deserving of complimentary meals in exchange for social media promotion. Her Yelp profile was a weapon of mass destruction, filled with one-star reviews designed to extort compensation from small businesses. She carried a small collection of foreign objects in her purse, ready to plant evidence of contamination when restaurants refused her demands. Bella Vista was experiencing its typical busy dinner rush when Olivia arrived, immediately demanding to speak with the manager about a business partnership. The restaurant owner, Maria Santos, politely explained that they didn't offer influencer discounts, but welcomed honest reviews from paying customers. Olivia's demeanor shifted instantly from fake sweetness to barely contained hostility. She ordered the most expensive seafood risotto on the menu, while muttering threats about destroying their reputation online. Her plan was simple: plant evidence, create a scene, and walk away without paying. 20 minutes later, Olivia began executing her scheme. She discreetly dropped a small piece of costume jewelry into her risotto, then began loudly complaining about finding a foreign object in her food. Other diners turned to watch as she held up the planted evidence, demanding the manager's immediate attention. Maria approached calmly, offering to replace the dish and remove it from the bill. But Olivia wanted more than compensation. She wanted a spectacle that would justify her fraudulent behavior and provide content for her social media accounts. Standing dramatically while holding her plate in front of her, Olivia announced to the entire restaurant that the food was contaminated and dangerous. She gestured wildly with the heavy ceramic plate, stepping backward to address the entire dining room. She fell backward, her head striking the hard tile floor with a sickening thud. In the process, the back of her skull took the brunt of the impact, causing severe brain trauma, while the forehead scraped against a slightly raised grout line, leaving a small but bleeding cut. The plate flew from her hands, shattering across the dining area and sending ceramic fragments skittering in all directions. Olivia was dazed, making strange gurgling sounds and unable to speak clearly. Blood pooled around her head and her hands were scratched by flying plate shards. Other diners screamed and stepped back in shock, while restaurant staff immediately called 911 and tried to provide first aid. Paramedics arrived minutes later and worked frantically to stabilize her, but the traumatic brain injury was too severe, and she died en route to the hospital. The investigation later revealed that Olivia had planted fake evidence in her food, and her history of similar scams at other establishments came to light. Security footage showed her deliberately placing the object in her meal before complaining. Maria Santos was devastated that someone had died in her restaurant, despite Olivia's fraudulent intentions. The restaurant installed better lighting and non-slip flooring in response to the accident. The incident became a cautionary tale in the hospitality industry about the unpredictable dangers that can arise when dealing with increasingly aggressive scam artists, and the importance of maintaining safe premises even during confrontational situations. It was January 20th, 2018, and the spacious community center in Scottsdale, Arizona, buzzed with the energy of health-conscious residents attending the monthly wellness fair. The 5,000-square-foot facility had been transformed into a marketplace of alternative health vendors, with booths promoting everything from crystal healing to dietary supplements. The desert sun streamed through large windows as nearly 200 attendees browsed displays of natural health products. Crystal Williams arranged her elaborate essential oil display with the precision of a pharmaceutical chemist, each small bottle labeled with bold claims about its healing properties. At 41, the multi-level marketing distributor had built her entire identity around promoting essential oils as miracle cures for every conceivable health problem. Her transformation from struggling single mother to zealous wellness evangelist had occurred over the past 3 years as she climbed the ranks of her health product network. Crystal's aggressive sales tactics had destroyed most of her personal relationships. As friends and family grew tired of her constant pitches, and dangerous medical advice. She had convinced several people to stop taking prescribed medications in favor of her oil treatments, including a diabetic neighbor who had been hospitalized after discontinuing insulin based on Crystal's claims that cinnamon oil could cure diabetes. The wellness fair represented Crystal's biggest opportunity to recruit new customers. She had prepared an elaborate demonstration designed to prove the safety of her products, planning to apply undiluted oils directly to her skin while making outrageous claims about their healing properties. Crystal's presentation quickly drew a crowd as she demonstrated increasingly reckless uses of her products, claiming they were completely safe. She opened several bottles of pure eucalyptus and tea tree oil she had purchased from an unregulated online supplier that advertised extra concentrated formulations. Crystal announced that she would prove the oil's safety by applying them directly to her skin, explaining that their higher potency made them more effective than standard aromatherapy products. She poured the undiluted eucalyptus oil across her forearms and rubbed it into her skin. Within minutes, her arms turned red and began to blister as the concentrated oils caused chemical burns. The strong vapors filled the air, and several people nearby began coughing from the overwhelming fumes. Soon after, the high concentration and chemical impurities in the untested oils triggered a severe allergic reaction that quickly progressed to anaphylaxis. Her airway began to close, and her blood pressure dropped as she stumbled behind the booth and collapsed while bystanders called for help. Paramedics stationed at the wellness fair arrived within minutes and began resuscitation efforts, but Crystal Williams was pronounced dead at 2:47 p.m. from anaphylactic shock, brought on by exposure to undiluted essential oils from an unregulated source. The wellness fair was shut down immediately, and the incident prompted renewed scrutiny of unregulated essential oil sales and false health claims. It was January 15, 2015, and the post-holiday shopping atmosphere at a large department store in Tampa, Florida, buzzed with customers returning unwanted gifts and taking advantage of clearance sales. The 120,000-square-foot store's customer service department had been overwhelmed since New Year's Day with returns, exchanges, and complaints from shoppers dealing with holiday purchases. Susan Rodriguez wheeled a shopping cart overflowing with designer clothing, shoes, and accessories toward the customer service counter, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who had perfected an elaborate scam. At 41, the administrative assistant had transformed retail returns into a lucrative side business, using fraudulent receipts and stolen credit cards to return obviously used merchandise for full refunds. Her spare bedroom had been converted into a warehouse of stolen goods. Susan's return fraud operation had generated over $30,000 in illegal profits over the past 2 years, funded by an elaborate network of fake identities, stolen credit cards, and forged receipts. She maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking her fraudulent activities across dozens of retailers, rotating between stores to avoid detection while building relationships with naive employees. The evolution from occasional fraudulent return to full-scale criminal enterprise had been gradual, beginning with legitimate returns that Susan realized could be manipulated for profit. She had studied store policies and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for creating fake documentation. That afternoon, Susan had arrived with her most ambitious scam yet, a cart full of obviously worn designer clothing that she planned to return using fake receipts. The merchandise showed clear signs of use, including makeup stains, stretched fabric, and missing tags. Susan approached the customer service counter, presenting a stack of obviously fraudulent receipts for merchandise that had clearly been worn extensively. When the customer service manager examined the merchandise and noticed the clear evidence of use, Susan became increasingly aggressive. She claimed the store was discriminating against her and threatened to file complaints with corporate headquarters. The manager politely explained that the store could not accept returns for obviously used merchandise without proper documentation. Susan's response was to become violent, throwing hangers and clothing items at the employees while screaming about customer service and corporate theft. Determined to take what she considered rightfully hers, Susan climbed over the customer service counter to access the cash register directly. Her face was flushed red with rage, and her breathing had become rapid and labored from the physical exertion and extreme stress of the confrontation. Years of poor diet, smoking, and untreated hypertension had taken their toll on her cardiovascular system. As Susan reached for the cash register, while screaming at the employees, the combination of extreme rage, physical exertion, and her pre-existing heart condition triggered a massive heart attack. She clutched her chest and collapsed behind the customer service counter, her face turning blue as her heart stopped beating. Despite immediate CPR attempts by store employees and paramedics who arrived within minutes, Susan Rodriguez died from cardiac arrest on the customer service floor, surrounded by the fraudulent merchandise she had tried to return. The stress and fury of her failed scam had literally caused her heart to give out. Investigation revealed an extensive criminal network involving stolen identities and return scams, totaling over $75,000. Curiously, Susan's purse contained a lottery ticket for that evening's drawing worth $50 million, a ticket she would never get to check, leaving people to wonder if her life of crime might have ended differently if she had just waited one more day. It was March 8, 2018, when 38-year-old Paige Turner discovered her leased BMW being loaded onto a tow truck in a downtown Seattle parking garage, and her world of legal threats was about to collide with cold mechanical reality. As a corporate lawyer specializing in what colleagues privately called frivolous lawsuits, Paige had built her career on finding fault in everything and everyone around her. Her vanity license plates with a bold message that hinted at her confrontational nature perfectly captured her approach to life. Paige treated parking regulations like suggestions, regularly occupying handicapped spaces while claiming she would only be a few minutes. Over 2 years, she had accumulated 47 unpaid parking tickets, each one accompanied by lengthy legal briefs challenging the citations in court. The downtown garage had become her personal battleground with authority. Despite multiple warnings and escalating fines, Paige continued parking wherever convenient, confident that her legal knowledge made her untouchable. Her BMW had been flagged for towing after reaching the threshold for unpaid violations. When Paige arrived that evening to find her car being secured to the flatbed, she immediately pulled out her phone and began recording. The tow truck operator, a weathered man in his 50s named Mike, had dealt with angry car owners before, but Paige's approach was uniquely aggressive. She positioned herself directly behind the truck to prevent it from leaving while filming what she called theft and illegal seizure. Mike tried explaining the legal towing process, but Paige was already deep into her litigation mindset, threatening lawsuits and demanding immediate release of her vehicle. Despite Mike's repeated warnings about the dangerous hydraulic equipment, Paige climbed onto the truck's flatbed, determined to reclaim what she considered her illegally seized property. The metal surface was slick from Seattle's persistent drizzle, and the truck's machinery hummed with mechanical power. As Paige moved around the flatbed while recording, she lost her footing on the slick surface. Her legs became caught in the hydraulic lift as it moved, and Mike heard her scream. The crushing force trapped her lower body between moving parts of the truck's equipment. Paige's screams echoed through the concrete garage as Mike immediately shut down the hydraulics and called 911. There was significant bleeding from her trapped legs, and she was clearly in severe distress. Mike tried to keep her conscious while waiting for emergency responders, but she was obviously going into shock from her injuries. Paramedics arrived quickly and worked to stabilize her while firefighters used specialized equipment to free her from the machinery. She was conscious but barely responsive during the extraction process. Despite rapid transport to the hospital, Paige died from her injuries. The medical examiner later determined the official cause of death. Security cameras captured portions of the incident, showing Paige's reckless behavior on the truck despite safety warnings. Mike was cleared of wrongdoing after investigators reviewed the available footage. The parking garage added safety barriers and additional warning signs around tow truck operations following the incident. Paige's death became a sobering reminder in the legal community about the dangers of letting confrontational behavior override basic safety precautions. Her colleagues privately noted the tragic irony that someone who spent her career threatening others with consequences had ultimately faced the most severe consequence of all, through her own reckless actions and disregard for clearly stated warnings. It was September 10th, 2016, in Plano, Texas, an early evening just after a passing thunderstorm. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving shallow puddles across the wide parking lot of a suburban grocery complex. The wet asphalt reflected the glow of overhead lights and the red brake beams of shoppers pulling out with weekend groceries. Rhonda Ellis, 46, was a self-employed real estate agent who managed several rental properties in the area. Tenants and co-workers described her as assertive, often getting into minor arguments over parking, delivery access, or who had the right to certain spaces. Her silver crossover SUV was parked several rows from the store entrance as she waited for her husband to arrive in a second vehicle. Around 6:20 p.m., a blue sedan turned into the same aisle. Security footage later showed it slowing as it approached an open parking space only a few feet from where Rhonda was standing. As the driver angled to pull in, Rhonda stepped forward and stood in the middle of the space, motioning with her hands for the car to stop. The sedan paused, blinkers still on. The driver rolled down the window and said something, but the camera's audio didn't pick it up. Witnesses nearby later told police they heard Rhonda insisting that the space was meant for her husband, who was on his way. When the driver gave up and turned toward another row, she remained standing there for a few seconds with her arms crossed before walking back toward her SUV, shaking her head. Footage showed her pulling a set of car keys from her jacket pocket and tossing them down in frustration. The keys bounced once and landed beside a metal light pole base where water had pooled from the earlier rain. She walked over to pick them up, unaware that the metal housing around the pole's base had been corroded for months. Maintenance records would later show that the wiring inside had been flagged for repair twice earlier that year, but never serviced. Moisture from the storm had seeped into the cracked seal, exposing a live wire that made intermittent contact with the metal casing whenever it was wet. Rhonda crouched beside the pole and reached down with her right hand. According to two shoppers across the aisle, there was a sudden blue-white flash followed by a loud pop. Rhonda's body stiffened, and she let out a single sharp scream before collapsing sideways onto the wet ground. Her right hand was still gripping the key ring, which was partly submerged in the shallow puddle. A man loading groceries into his truck stopped when he saw the flash and realized she had collapsed. He stepped forward but froze when he noticed small sparks dancing across the puddle around the pole. Others nearby hesitated too, unsure what had happened. One shopper yelled for everyone to stay back while someone inside the store alerted employees. Within minutes, workers used cones and carts to block off the aisle, as the smell of burned plastic and faint electrical crackling filled the air. Fire department responders reached the scene at 6:31 p.m. and immediately cut power to the entire lighting circuit for the lot. Paramedics approached once the voltage was confirmed off, but Rhonda was already unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later identified electrocution as the cause of death, consistent with high-voltage contact through a conductive surface in standing water. Investigators found that corrosion in an underground junction had caused a short during the storm. Tests showed the current reached over 200 volts, strong enough to stop a heartbeat instantly. The store closed the section that night for inspection. Records revealed earlier repair requests were ignored. By the next day, city crews sealed all pole bases and added warning signs while planning full rewiring. It was November 23, 2017, when 42-year-old Victoria Lawson strutted into Westfield Shopping Center in Phoenix, Arizona, with her phone already recording and her litigation mindset fully activated. As a real estate agent who had never met a lawsuit she didn't like, Victoria treated every interaction as potential evidence for her next court case. Her silver BMW in the parking lot bore the infamous "Live Laugh, Litigate" decal that had become her calling card around town. Victoria had transformed customer complaints into an art form, having been banned from 3 different Starbucks locations for screaming at teenage baristas over drink temperatures and name spellings. Her Yelp profile read like a legal threat generator, with each one-star review promising lawsuits and demanding compensation. The Black Friday shopping frenzy provided the perfect hunting ground for Victoria's predatory behavior. She had arrived specifically to document what she called employee incompetence, armed with expired coupons and an arsenal of unreasonable demands designed to create confrontational situations. At a popular clothing store, Victoria zeroed in on her target, an 18-year-old cashier named Emma, who was working her first Black Friday shift. Victoria presented a 15% discount coupon that had expired 2 months earlier, demanding it be honored, despite the clear expiration date printed in bold letters. When Emma politely explained store policy regarding expired coupons, Victoria's face began turning red. She immediately started filming, positioning her phone to capture what she planned to frame as discrimination and illegal business practices. Her voice rose to theatrical levels as she berated the teenager about customer rights and threatened legal action. The store manager, a patient woman in her 30s, approached to defuse the situation. She calmly reiterated the expired coupon policy while offering alternative discounts available that day. But Victoria was beyond reason, her anger escalating with each passing moment. Victoria's breathing became labored as she worked herself into an extreme rage. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the air conditioning, and her face turned an alarming shade of crimson. She began hyperventilating while screaming about corporate conspiracies and customer discrimination. Other shoppers backed away as Victoria's tirade reached dangerous intensity levels. Her hands shook as she pointed accusingly at the staff, her voice cracking from the strain of sustained yelling. Suddenly, Victoria clutched her chest and stumbled backward. She had a history of high blood pressure, which made her collapse under the extreme stress of her tirade even more dangerous. Her phone slipped from her hand as she fell, struggling to breathe and coughing sharply. Emma immediately called 911 while the manager and other customers tried to help. Victoria was conscious but clearly in severe distress, unable to speak coherently. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and she kept clutching her chest. Paramedics arrived and worked on Victoria before transporting her to the hospital. She never regained full consciousness during transport and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Emma, the teenage cashier, was shaken by the incident, along with other shoppers who witnessed Victoria's collapse. Store security footage captured the entire incident, showing Victoria's extreme agitation before her collapse. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death, though the results weren't immediately released. Victoria's family declined to speak with reporters about the incident. The shopping center reviewed its customer service protocols following the tragedy, and the incident became a talking point about the dangers of extreme anger and confrontational behavior in retail environments. It was June 28, 2017, at a public pool in Fairview, Washington, a small suburban city preparing for its busiest swim season. The afternoon was warm, and a steady line had formed at the entrance. Families carried towels, sunscreen, and pool toys, while the posted rules beside the gate reminded guests that outside food and drinks were not permitted past the check-in area. Standing in line with a large iced coffee was 41-year-old Denise Halbrook, known among neighbors for heated confrontations over small regulations. Residents who lived near her townhouse described her as someone who often demanded to speak to management whenever things didn't go her way. The staff at a local grocery store had previously documented disputes with her over return policies, discount limits, and parking spaces. That afternoon at the pool, her behavior followed the same pattern. As she approached the front desk, the teenage attendant repeated the policy: no outside food or drinks. Most guests either finished their drinks or tossed them. Denise didn't. Witnesses said her posture changed immediately. She raised her voice, waved her coffee cup, and argued that she'd paid too much to give it up. She compared the rule to a nearby town's pool and leaned toward the counter, pointing at the sign while criticizing it loudly. The attendant repeated the standard response, but Denise grew more agitated, questioning his authority and gesturing with the cup. When nothing changed, CCTV showed her abruptly dumping the entire drink across the check-in computer. Coffee splashed over the keyboard, ran down the cords, and the monitor flickered as the system shorted. The attendant stepped back while the lifeguard supervisor signaled for help. People in line shuffled away, unsure what she would do next. After being told police were being contacted, witnesses said Denise muttered angrily and backed away from the counter, still shouting. Security footage showed her taking several quick steps backward without looking behind her. The ground had a thin, slick layer of water from swimmers all afternoon. According to bystanders, her heel slipped the moment it touched the wet patch. One person reported seeing her arm jerk outward as she tried to catch herself, but her momentum carried her back. CCTV captured her foot skidding, her body dropping, and her head striking the concrete edge with a loud impact. She did not move afterward. A bystander called for space while the supervisor dialed 911. Parents pulled their children aside as staff kept the walkway clear. EMTs arrived within minutes, assessed her where she fell, and witnesses said it was clear she remained unresponsive throughout. Later that afternoon, officials confirmed Denise Hallbrook died from severe head trauma caused by hitting the concrete. Security footage showed the entire sequence: her argument at the desk, the backward steps into a wet area, the slip, and the fatal impact. The pool added more non-slip mats and strengthened procedures for enforcing gate rules during crowded hours. It was June 12, 2015, and the vibrant Saturday morning atmosphere of a downtown farmers market in Portland filled the square with the sounds of live music, chattering vendors, and families enjoying the Pacific Northwest's finest local produce. The weekly market featured over 80 vendors selling everything from organic vegetables to artisanal cheeses, creating a 2-acre outdoor marketplace that attracted thousands of health-conscious shoppers each weekend. Beverly Chen adjusted her reusable hemp shopping bags as she surveyed the market stalls with the intensity of a military strategist planning an assault. At 45, the yoga studio owner had transformed her interest in healthy eating into an obsession with pure organic food that she believed was the only safe nutrition available in a world she saw as deliberately poisoned by corporate agriculture. Her conversion to extreme organic-only eating had begun 3 years earlier, after reading conspiracy theories about pesticide use that convinced her that conventional farming was part of a plot to sicken the population. Beverly's weekly farmers market visits had become increasingly confrontational as she appointed herself the unofficial food purity police, lecturing other shoppers about their choices and harassing vendors about their farming practices. She carried a notebook filled with the names of farms she had researched online, cross-referencing each vendor's claims against her extensive database of approved organic producers. Her aggressive questioning had led to several heated arguments with farmers, who she accused of lying about their growing methods. The yoga studio Beverly owned had lost half its students over the past year as her extreme dietary beliefs began influencing her teaching. She would interrupt classes to lecture students about the dangers of non-organic food and had banned anyone from bringing conventional snacks into her facility. Her own health had deteriorated significantly due to her restrictive eating patterns, but she refused medical treatment, claiming that doctors were part of the conspiracy to promote unhealthy food. Beverly's family had staged an intervention 6 months earlier, concerned about her dramatic weight loss and increasingly paranoid behavior. She had cut contact with relatives who wouldn't adopt her extreme dietary restrictions, viewing their concern as evidence that they had been brainwashed by corporate food propaganda. That morning, Beverly discovered that one of her trusted vendors was selling both organic and conventionally grown produce from the same booth, a practice she viewed as contamination of pure food with poisonous chemicals. She began her confrontation quietly, questioning the farmer about his growing methods while other customers browsed his selection of summer vegetables. When the farmer explained that he grew both organic and conventional crops to serve different customer needs, Beverly's voice rose to a shout that could be heard throughout the market square. She screamed about people being poisoned, pointing at the conventionally grown tomatoes as if they were radioactive waste. Beverly began grabbing conventional vegetables from the display and throwing them at other customers, screaming warnings about pesticide contamination, while the farmer tried to calm her down. Market security approached as her behavior became increasingly erratic, but Beverly was beyond reasoning as her obsession with food purity reached a breaking point. In her rage, Beverly grabbed the vendor's metal canopy support pole intending to use it as a weapon against what she saw as the forces of food contamination. The heavy aluminum pole was unwieldy in her malnourished hands, and as she swung it wildly, she lost her balance and slipped on the vegetables she had thrown across the ground. Beverly fell backward with tremendous force, still gripping the pole as the canopy frame tipped with her. Both struck the pavement together, and the metal bar hit her head on impact, causing a fatal skull fracture. She never regained consciousness among the scattered organic produce she had been defending, her body surrounded by the vegetables she believed were humanity's salvation. Beverly Chen was pronounced dead at the scene at 10:15 a.m. from massive head trauma. Market staff later confirmed that she had refused all medical care leading up to the incident despite warnings about her deteriorating health. It was November 18, 2014, and the cozy atmosphere of Grind Coffee House in Portland, Oregon, filled with the familiar sounds of espresso machines, quiet conversations, and the gentle clicking of laptop keyboards. The converted warehouse space featured exposed brick walls, vintage furniture, and large windows that provided natural light for dozens of freelancers, students, and remote workers. Brenda Morrison arranged her laptop, external monitor, and graphic design materials across 2 tables near the main Wi-Fi router, creating a makeshift office that she defended with territorial instincts. At 52, the freelance graphic designer had appointed herself the unofficial monitor of public Wi-Fi usage, timing other customers with a stopwatch and confronting anyone who exceeded what she considered reasonable internet time. Her daily routine involved arriving at opening time to claim the best spot and aggressively defending her territory. Brenda's obsession with Wi-Fi policing had developed over the past year as her graphic design business struggled, and she spent increasingly long hours in coffee shops. She had created elaborate theories about bandwidth theft and internet freeloading, convinced that other customers were deliberately slowing down her connection to sabotage her work. The transformation from quiet customer to Wi-Fi vigilante had been gradual, beginning with polite suggestions about sharing internet resources and escalating to aggressive confrontations with college students and other freelancers. Brenda had been asked to leave multiple establishments for harassing customers, but she always returned the next day with renewed determination. That morning, Brenda had noticed a college student working on what appeared to be a research paper, his laptop open for over 2 hours. In Brenda's mind, this constituted bandwidth theft that was directly impacting her ability to upload large graphic design files to clients. Brenda marched over to the student's table with her stopwatch in hand, launching into a loud lecture about Wi-Fi etiquette. When the student ignored her and kept working, she escalated by attempting to disconnect the main router from the wall. The device was mounted about 8 feet up to prevent tampering, but Brenda was determined to reach it and assert her control. She dragged over an old wooden chair that had been part of the coffee shop's vintage furniture collection. The chair showed signs of wear and had a loose leg that the staff had been meaning to repair. Brenda climbed onto the unstable chair, stretching to reach the router while continuing to lecture the room about internet freeloading. Employees shouted for her to get down, but the moment passed too quickly for anyone to reach her. The old wooden chair, weakened by years of use, collapsed under her weight. She fell backward from the 8-foot height, her head striking the concrete floor with tremendous force. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fractured skull. Brenda Morrison lost consciousness immediately and died from massive brain injury before paramedics could arrive. Her fall had been witnessed by dozens of customers who called 911, but the damage from hitting the concrete floor was too severe to survive. Investigators found that Brenda had been documenting other customers' internet usage in a detailed journal, including photos and personal information, a discovery that raised questions about whether her Wi-Fi policing was masking more serious stalking behavior. It was May 13, 2017, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a warm Saturday morning when the aisles of a local discount supermarket were packed with weekend shoppers. The steady hum of carts and checkout scanners filled the air. At Register 6, the line stretched nearly to the back of the produce section as people waited to pay for groceries and household items. Among them was Patricia Larkin, known by many in her neighborhood as Patty. She was 52, a retired librarian who lived alone on the east side of town. Former co-workers described her as outspoken, someone who never hesitated to correct others in public if she thought they were wrong. She came to the store regularly, often mid-morning on weekends when lines were longest. At around 10:40 a.m., surveillance footage later showed Patty pushing her cart past at least 5 customers in line at the self-checkout area. She positioned her cart directly behind another shopper who was placing items on the conveyor. A man in his 30s wearing a gray sweatshirt told her the end of the line was behind him. Witnesses said she looked straight at him and raised her voice, saying she didn't have time to deal with delays. Several people in line turned their heads as her voice carried through the checkout area. The man repeated himself, gesturing toward the line that extended behind the soda display. Instead of moving, Patty gripped her cart and pushed it forward, striking the back of the man's legs. The sound of metal wheels against the tile floor made several people step back. A store employee at the service counter began walking toward the commotion, but before he reached them, multiple shoppers had already started recording with their phones. The video later confirmed that the man did not retaliate. He stepped aside, raising his hands in disbelief, while Patty began unloading her groceries onto the belt. One of the witnesses, a woman near the express lane, told investigators that Patty seemed flustered and was muttering under her breath as she reached for items from her cart. Her movements were quick and jerky. Another customer, standing 2 registers away, said she complained that the store needed better trained staff. At that point, the manager on duty, identified later in reports as David Hall, approached from the customer service counter. He stood a few feet away and asked her to step aside to resolve the issue calmly. Patty turned, one hand still gripping her cart handle. Her body was angled halfway between the belt and the aisle divider. The surveillance footage captured what happened next. As she turned to respond, the front wheel of her shopping cart caught the edge of the metal guardrail that lined the base of the conveyor. When she tried to shift her foot, her right shoe slipped between the small gap near the rail. The cart tilted slightly, and she instinctively yanked her leg back to free herself. That movement caused her to lose balance. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing briefly before her body hit the floor. Her head struck the corner of a low-standing freezer that held packaged meat products near the checkout area. The impact produced a dull, heavy sound that was clearly audible on the store's security audio. Witnesses said the entire area went silent. A woman screamed for help, and several shoppers backed away, leaving their carts behind. The man she had argued with stood motionless, still holding his phone. The manager knelt beside Patty, who remained unresponsive. Another employee called 911 from the service counter while customers began clearing the surrounding lanes. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but emergency personnel later confirmed she had sustained a fatal skull fracture and brain hemorrhage from the impact. Security footage showed that the entire confrontation, from the moment she cut the line to the moment she fell, lasted less than 2 minutes. Store policy required a full shutdown of the affected checkout area, and customers were redirected to the remaining lanes. By 11:15 a.m., yellow tape surrounded registers 6 and 7, while police reviewed footage and took statements. Her cart remained across 2 lanes, half filled with groceries. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall caused by imbalance and blunt force trauma. The store reopened that evening, adding padding to the freezer corner involved in the incident. It was August 19, 2018, and the cool mountain air carried the sounds of urban life through the courtyard of Pine Ridge Apartments in Denver, Colorado. The 3-story complex housed nearly 200 residents in 80 units, their evening routines creating the normal symphony of apartment living. The scent of dinner preparations drifted from open windows, mixing with the fresh smell of recently watered landscaping. Margaret Daniels pressed her ear against the wall, separating her unit from her neighbors, her decibel meter registering the faint sound of a television at normal volume. At 46, the government clerk had developed an obsession with noise complaints, filing numerous formal grievances during her 2 years of residency. Her persistent complaints had resulted in several families moving out of the complex. Margaret documented sounds throughout the day, maintaining logs with timestamps and decibel readings. She would pound on walls and ceilings at various hours, demanding quiet from neighbors who were conducting normal daily activities. Her apartment contained multiple sound monitoring devices and stacks of complaint documentation. The upstairs neighbors, the Chen family, had endured months of Margaret's complaints about normal activities like walking across their floor and watching television at reasonable volumes. Tonight, their 8-year-old daughter was practicing piano at 7 p.m., well within the building's designated quiet hours that didn't begin until 10 p.m. Margaret became increasingly agitated as the piano music drifted through the ceiling. She grabbed her decibel meter and complaint forms, going upstairs to confront the family about what she considered excessive noise. Her pounding on their door echoed through the hallway, but the Chens had learned to ignore her complaints. Frustrated by their refusal to answer, Margaret retrieved a maintenance ladder from the storage closet and positioned it against the building's exterior wall. She planned to climb onto the Chen's second-floor balcony to continue her confrontation, bypassing their locked door. The wooden balcony railing, installed when the complex was built in 1987, had been weakened by 31 years of Colorado weather extremes. Freeze-thaw cycles had loosened the bolts, and recent heavy rains had rotted the support posts, though the damage wasn't visible from ground level. Margaret climbed the ladder with her complaint notebook tucked under her arm and her decibel meter hanging from her belt. At 5 feet 6 inches and 160 pounds, she represented a significant load for the compromised railing system. Other residents watched from their windows as she reached the balcony level, some recording the scene on their phones. Margaret pounded on the sliding glass door while the Chen family remained inside. She leaned her full weight against the railing to get closer to the window, applying pressure to the weakest section of the deteriorated structure. The railing gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtyard. Margaret fell 3 stories onto the concrete courtyard below, her body striking the pavement with an impact that could be heard throughout the complex. The fall created a loud disturbance that startled neighbors who had been sleeping peacefully despite her constant complaints about normal living sounds. She died instantly from multiple fractures and massive internal injuries, her decibel meter shattered beside her body. The apartment complex faced liability issues for the unsafe balcony railing that hadn't been properly maintained or inspected. A structural engineer's report revealed that multiple balconies throughout the property had similar deterioration, leading to a renovation project. Neighbors provided evidence of Margaret's harassment campaign, documenting her behavior toward families conducting normal daily activities. The Chen family moved out within a month following the incident. New building management implemented policies requiring mediation before eviction proceedings for noise complaints. They installed soundproofing in units with shared walls and established quiet hours that balanced residents' rights to both peace and normal living activities. The complex installed safety barriers around all balconies and implemented regular structural inspections. Margaret's apartment was converted into a community room where residents could resolve disputes through mediation. It was March 12, 2018. And the peaceful morning atmosphere of Pediatric Associates Clinic in Denver, Colorado, was disrupted by the sound of shouting and clanking metal as parents arriving for their children's appointments encountered an unexpected obstacle. The medical office, located in a quiet suburban strip mall, typically provided a calm environment for routine checkups and vaccinations, but today's schedule would be interrupted by an act of extremist protest that would turn deadly. Margaret Johnson adjusted the heavy chains wrapped around her waist as she prepared to make what she believed would be a heroic stand against what she called medical tyranny. At 44, the real estate agent had become obsessed with anti-vaccine conspiracy theories after spending countless hours on social media groups that promoted dangerous misinformation about childhood immunizations. Her transformation from successful businesswoman to radical activist had cost her clients, friendships, and family relationships. But Margaret believed she was fighting to save children from what she saw as government-sponsored poisoning. Margaret's descent into anti-vaccine extremism had begun 2 years earlier when her sister's child developed a fever after routine vaccinations, an event that Margaret became convinced was evidence of a massive medical conspiracy. She had immersed herself in online communities that reinforced her fears and provided increasingly radical interpretations of medical research. Her home office was filled with printed articles from discredited websites, homemade signs with alarming slogans, and a megaphone she used during her frequent protests outside medical facilities. The escalation from online activism to real-world confrontation had been gradual, beginning with sharing misinformation on social media and evolving into disrupting medical appointments and harassing healthcare workers. Margaret had been arrested multiple times for trespassing at pediatric offices, but each arrest only reinforced her belief that she was being persecuted for exposing the truth. Her car contained boxes of pamphlets with fabricated medical claims and a collection of chains and padlocks for her planned acts of civil disobedience. That morning, Margaret had arrived at the pediatric clinic with a detailed plan to chain herself to the front entrance during a scheduled vaccination clinic, preventing parents from accessing what she believed were dangerous medical procedures. She had promoted the protest on social media, encouraging other anti-vaccine activists to join her in what she called a mission to protect innocent children from medical harm. Margaret began her protest by wrapping heavy chains around her waist and attempting to secure herself to the glass front door of the medical office. She had practiced the procedure at home, but the actual execution proved more difficult than anticipated, as she struggled with the padlocks while trying to operate her phone to live stream the event for her online followers. As Margaret worked to secure the chains, she began shouting through her megaphone about medical tyranny and the dangers of vaccines, her voice echoing through the strip mall parking lot. Parents arriving with their children for appointments were forced to witness her increasingly erratic behavior, as she claimed to be protecting their kids from poisoning and mind control. When security personnel arrived and attempted to remove Margaret from the property, she became violent and began swinging the heavy chain still attached to her waist. The 6-foot length of metal chain became a dangerous weapon, as Margaret flailed wildly, trying to prevent anyone from approaching her or interfering with her protest. In her frenzied movements, Margaret lost control of the heavy chain and struck herself in the head with tremendous force. The metal links connected with her temple, causing severe head trauma and a fractured skull. The impact was so forceful that Margaret immediately lost consciousness and collapsed to the ground, still chained to the doorframe. Margaret Johnson died from massive brain injury caused by her own chain, bleeding internally as her anti-vaccine pamphlets scattered around her body in the morning breeze. Her live stream continued recording as she died, broadcasting her final moments to the online community that had encouraged her extremist behavior. The pediatric office was forced to close for the day, causing dozens of children to miss important vaccinations. Investigation revealed that Margaret had been planning increasingly dangerous protests, including attempts to disrupt hospital emergency rooms and medical conferences. Strangely, Margaret's phone contained a draft social media post scheduled for later that day that read, "If something happens to me, know that I died fighting for the truth," a message that suggested she may have anticipated the dangerous outcome of her protest, raising questions about whether her death was accidental or a form of martyrdom for her cause. It was August 4th, 2017 in Eugene, Oregon, a Friday night when the downtown multiplex was packed for the late showing of a new superhero movie. The air smelled of popcorn and soda, and ushers moved between theaters cleaning up from earlier showings. Inside Auditorium 6, where the 10:30 p.m. screening was just beginning, 48-year-old Linda Sinclair had already taken a seat in the middle row, sipping from a large drink and scrolling through her phone. Linda worked as a retail supervisor at a clothing outlet nearby and was known to coworkers as outspoken and sometimes argumentative. According to friends, she often came to late movies alone after having drinks at a bar down the street that night. She had purchased a general admission ticket, but sat in a seat marked as reserved, part of the theater's new numbered seating system that had caused confusion and frequent disputes since being introduced a few months earlier. At 10:37 p.m., a couple entered and walked toward the center of the row where Linda was seated. Their tickets showed the same seat number she occupied, and they asked her to move. Witnesses said she refused, insisting she had arrived first. The couple went to get assistance, and 2 ushers returned a few minutes later, checking tickets under the dim theater lighting. When they asked her to move to her assigned seat, she declined. Security footage showed Linda standing, holding her phone, and arguing with staff while waiting for a manager. When he approached, she began recording, and nearby patrons started watching as the dispute grew louder. As the ushers stood their ground, Linda began stepping backward, trying to keep all 3 employees in her camera frame. The stadium-style seating had narrow, steep steps between each row, with just enough width for a single foot. Witnesses seated 2 rows below later said she moved without looking behind her. When her heel landed partly off the step, her weight shifted suddenly. Her left ankle twisted and she lost balance. In one motion, her body tipped backward into the aisle. The fall covered about 5 feet in elevation, enough to generate a strong impact. Her head struck the steel base of the aisle handrail before her phone slid down several steps, its flashlight still on. The theater went silent for several seconds before a man near the aisle called out for help. Staff immediately stopped the film and turned on the overhead lights. The ushers moved the crowd back while one checked for a pulse. A nurse who happened to be in the audience assisted until paramedics arrived roughly 7 minutes later. Linda was unresponsive and was later pronounced dead at the hospital from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Police reviewed the footage from both the theater cameras and audience phones. The investigation determined the fall was accidental and that staff had acted appropriately. Toxicology tests found moderate alcohol levels in her system, but no drugs. The medical examiner confirmed a fatal skull fracture consistent with impact against a fixed metal surface. The theater reopened the next day, but implemented new safety and seating protocols. Ushers were instructed to verify reserved seating before each showing to prevent disputes, and small warning signs were added to stairway entries reminding patrons to watch their step. Staff later said it was the first and only fatal accident the location had ever experienced, an argument that turned tragic within seconds. It was July 4th, 2013, and the oppressive Florida heat shimmered off the asphalt of West Shore Plaza's parking lot in Tampa. The shopping center buzzed with holiday activity as nearly 500 cars filled the sprawling lot, their occupants seeking air-conditioned relief from the 95-degree temperature. The smell of hot asphalt mixed with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of barbecue from a nearby restaurant. Deborah Morrison adjusted her homemade parking enforcement badge as she surveyed the parking lot with the authority of a self-appointed monitor. At 51, the bank manager had developed an obsession with parking violations at the mall, carrying printed notices and a digital camera to document what she considered improper parking. Her behavior had cost her friendships and strained her marriage, but she refused to abandon what she saw as her duty. Deborah kept records of license plates and would call police to report violations. Even when no actual laws had been broken, she had confronted numerous shoppers over the past 2 years, turning minor parking disputes into major confrontations that often required security intervention. Mall management had repeatedly asked her to stop, but she insisted she was providing a public service. Her latest targets were a young family loading groceries into their SUV. The Johnsons had parked legally within the designated lines, but Deborah believed they were too close to the cart return area, violating her personal interpretation of parking regulations. Deborah positioned herself directly behind their vehicle while taking photos of their license plate, shouting about parking violations and threatening to call police. The father, Mark Johnson, tried to ignore her while securing his children in their car seats, but Deborah's harassment continued to escalate. When Mark began backing out slowly, Deborah deliberately positioned herself behind the moving vehicle, refusing to move despite his warnings. She pounded on the rear window while continuing her complaints about parking violations, her face red with rage in the sweltering heat. The SUV's rear bumper struck Deborah as she moved closer to prevent their departure. The impact knocked her backward onto the concrete, and her head struck the curb. The sound echoed across the parking lot as witnesses called for help. But Deborah Morrison died from severe brain trauma. Security footage showed Deborah's aggressive behavior and deliberate positioning behind the moving vehicle. The driver was initially charged with vehicular manslaughter, but charges were dropped when witnesses testified about her actions. The mall hired professional parking attendants and installed additional security cameras following the incident. It was August 14, 2018, in the coastal town of Pacifica, California. A warm, late morning with steady waves and light wind along the shoreline. Weekend crowds filled the beach, and a small local cable crew collected background footage for a lifestyle segment, wide shots of surfers, vendors, and swimmers moving in the water. One of the beachgoers was 42-year-old Melissa Davenport, familiar to regulars for her habit of correcting strangers and challenging staff. She worked as a freelance event planner, and neighbors said she often carried that assertive attitude everywhere she went. Weighing around 240 pounds, she used a wide, soft-top longboard for stability, since she wasn't an experienced surfer. Earlier that morning, witnesses said she was already paddling beyond the beginner zone, speaking loudly about how she understood the water better than the staff monitoring conditions. Regular surfers noted she'd been warned repeatedly about the breakwater currents on past visits, but she brushed off every caution as unnecessary advice meant for inexperienced riders. Lifeguards had issued early warnings about a strong side current pushing toward the old breakwater at the north end. One guard approached Melissa as she dragged her board toward the water, reminding her to stay within the main swim zone. Melissa immediately raised her voice, insisting the warnings were exaggerated and that she was not some beginner needing constant supervision. When the guard pointed out that her ankle leash was loose, she dismissed him, saying it felt restrictive and she would adjust it later. That looseness left extra slack in the cord, which later allowed the board to drift just far enough for the leash to snap tight with force. The cable crew's roaming camera briefly captured Melissa walking into the surf, while making comments to nearby swimmers about lifeguards power tripping. She paddled past the first breaking waves, continuing to talk loudly about how people exaggerate currents to scare tourists. The current pushed her steadily northward, but she ignored repeated gestures from the lifeguard tower to angle back toward the center. She tried to stand, but the front edge of her board dipped under the surface. The board tilted forward, and she fell off. Witnesses said she attempted to surface immediately, but the side current had already pushed her board toward the submerged rocks near the breakwater. According to several beachgoers, Melissa surfaced once, coughing, with her arms moving toward the board. As the current pushed the longboard into the rocks, the leash reached full tension. Witnesses said they saw her body jerk downward when the stretched leash pulled her underwater. People on the breakwater reported hearing her yell moments before the current rotated her sideways. A small retreating wave pulled her in the direction of the rocks again, and her head lifted above the water only briefly. Footage from the cable crew's distant camera later confirmed that the longboard had drifted into the breakwater, its nose catching on a submerged lip of stone. The board stayed wedged at an angle while the current continued to push water past it. A few seconds later, beachgoers closest to the breakwater reported hearing a single dull impact, consistent with her head striking one of the submerged stone surfaces beneath the chop. Lifeguards went in immediately, with one calling for backup as the other swam toward her. A brief lull in the current allowed them to pull her to shore, but she showed no movement when they lifted her above the waterline. CPR began right away, and beach staff cleared the area. EMTs arrived about 5 minutes after the emergency call and took over the resuscitation efforts, continuing CPR while assessing her condition. Their work lasted only a short time before they signaled to stop. Officials later confirmed that Melissa Davenport died from blunt head trauma, consistent with striking submerged rock after the tightened leash pulled her into the breakwater. Footage from the cable crew helped verify the sequence of events and her earlier disregard of warnings. The town later expanded its current zone markers and updated safety briefings, citing the case as a preventable incident. It was November 8, 2015, in Mesa, Arizona, a dry, cool afternoon that brought steady weekend traffic into the Crosswinds shopping plaza. Inside the strip mall's small pet store, the usual chatter of birds and hum of aquarium filters filled the air. Employees were busy tending to customers buying food, tanks, and small animals. At around 3:20 p.m., the store's front counter area became the scene of an argument that would end in a sudden and tragic accident. The customer was 39-year-old Sharon Malloy, an office administrator and divorced mother of one who lived a few miles away. She was a regular at the store, often stopping by for bird feed and supplies. Employees described her as outspoken, known for questioning prices and frequently asking for discounts on items she thought were overpriced. That day, Sharon came in asking about a small parakeet she'd seen on a previous visit. The bird had been part of a local rescue program that worked with the shop, and its adoption fee was listed at $25 to cover care and medical costs. According to witnesses, Sharon argued that the store shouldn't charge for rescued animals. She spoke loudly enough that nearby customers turned to look. The employee at the counter, a college student working part-time, tried explaining that the fee went to the rescue organization, not the store itself. Sharon didn't accept the explanation and kept arguing, insisting the fee was unfair. She lifted a small metal bird cage from her cart and began pointing out its flaws: bent bars, a loose latch, chipped paint along the bottom edge. Witnesses said she waved it slightly as she spoke, her movements sharp enough that the employee stepped back from the counter. The store's security footage showed Sharon setting the cage down hard on the counter, then lifting it again in frustration. Behind her, another customer quietly moved away from the register area. When she slammed the cage down a second time, its lower edge struck the electrical cord of a heat lamp that was clamped to a reptile tank nearby. The lamp jolted loose and dropped behind the counter, hitting a plastic bottle of glass cleaner stored on a lower shelf. The cleaner contained ammonia and alcohol-based solvents, common in commercial products but highly flammable. The bulb, still hot from continuous use, shattered on impact. In the same instant, the escaping vapor ignited, producing a brief but intense flash. Employees described hearing a sharp pop and seeing a burst of orange flame that spread upward from the floor to the counter. Sharon's blouse, made of lightweight polyester, caught fire almost immediately. Surveillance video later showed her stepping back in shock, waving her arms as the fabric began to melt against her skin. Two employees rushed forward. One grabbed a towel from the grooming station, while another unplugged the lamp's power cord. They managed to smother the flames within seconds, but by then Sharon had suffered severe burns to her upper torso and right arm. A customer ran outside to flag down a passing patrol car, and the officer radioed for paramedics. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and transported Sharon to a nearby burn center. She was pronounced dead later that evening due to thermal injuries and secondary complications from smoke inhalation. The fire department investigation concluded that the ignition was accidental, but preventable. Inspectors noted that the lamp's power cord had been improperly routed near cleaning supplies, and the clamp securing the fixture to the tank had loosened from repeated use. Although the heat output was within normal range, contact with the flammable vapors was enough to start the flash fire. Investigators ruled the fire an accident caused by unsafe equipment placement, with no criminal charges filed. The store closed for cleanup and repairs as inspectors documented burn damage across the counter and shelving. It reopened a week later with new glass enclosures for all heat lamps, added safety guards and warning signs reminding customers to keep items clear of electrical cords. It was November 24, 2017, when 45-year-old Chloe Simmons arrived at Megamart Supercenter in Dallas, Texas, at 4 in the morning, already seething with the kind of rage that had consumed her life since losing her office job 6 months earlier. Rather than examining her own poor work performance and attendance issues, Chloe had embraced conspiracy theories and blamed immigrants for stealing opportunities from what she called real Americans. Her unemployment had given her endless hours to marinate in online hate groups and patriot forums, where she posted daily rants about foreign invasion and corporate conspiracies. Chloe's social media presence was a toxic wasteland of racist memes and angry videos filmed from her cluttered apartment, attracting a small but vocal following of similarly bitter individuals. Black Friday represented the perfect storm for Chloe's twisted worldview. She saw the diverse crowd of shoppers and immigrant employees as evidence of America's decline, and she had come prepared to document what she called the systematic replacement of American workers. Her phone was already recording as she stood in line, making loud comments about foreign products and non-English conversations around her. The early morning crowd was typical for Black Friday. Families seeking deals, college students buying electronics, and working people hoping to stretch their budgets. But Chloe saw enemies everywhere, particularly focusing her hatred on the store's Sikh employee, Rajesh, who wore a traditional turban while stocking shelves near the electronics section. When the doors opened at 6 a.m., Chloe immediately began pushing through crowds while filming herself and shouting about taking back America. Other shoppers tried to avoid her increasingly aggressive behavior as she confronted employees she perceived as foreign, demanding to see their documentation and work permits. Store security was monitoring her disruptive behavior, but the Black Friday chaos made immediate intervention difficult. Her rage reached a crescendo when she approached Rajesh, screaming racist slurs while other customers intervened to defend him. The young man remained professional despite her vicious harassment. In her escalating frenzy, Chloe grabbed a shopping cart and began ramming it into a display of canned goods, screaming about foreign contamination. The impact knocked several dozen heavy cans from the upper shelves, which began falling around her. Other shoppers backed away as merchandise continued tumbling from the damaged display. Store employees rushed toward the area, shouting warnings, but Chloe was still attacking the display while filming her destructive rampage. A particularly heavy 24-pack case of steel canned tomatoes, each can weighing over a pound, toppled from the upper shelf and struck Chloe directly on the side of her head near the temple. The force of the impact sent her staggering backward, where she tripped over scattered cans and fell hard onto the concrete floor. Witnesses saw her head hit the ground with significant force. She wasn't moving, and blood was visible around her head. The falling merchandise had stopped, but Chloe remained motionless on the floor. Despite the paramedics' rapid efforts, she did not make it, and later died from her injuries. Store employees and customers slowly regained their composure, still shaken by the chaos they had witnessed. The scattered cans and broken display remained as silent reminders of the sudden violence, while emergency crews worked quickly to remove her from the scene. Security footage later confirmed what everyone had feared. Chloe had attacked the display deliberately, her actions escalating with each passing moment. Rajesh, the employee she had targeted with harassment, quietly returned to his duties, visibly affected by the ordeal, yet determined to keep working, despite the memory of the morning's terror. The store reopened later that day, but the atmosphere felt tense. Employees and customers moved cautiously, some still glancing at the electronics section where it happened. Megamart added stronger shelving and better safety measures, but the memory of the tragedy lingered. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.